Ellesmere Island lies at the northern edge of the Canadian Arctic archipelago, a place defined more by absence than by presence. For most of the year, it remains locked in ice. The land is a stretch of rock, snow, and frozen fjords, shaped by wind and cold rather than by human use. Temperatures remain below freezing for long periods, and during winter the sun disappears entirely, leaving months of darkness. In the early 1880s, this region was almost entirely unknown to outsiders. Maps were incomplete. Coastlines were guessed at more than measured. What little was recorded came from brief visits by earlier explorers who stayed only long enough to confirm how difficult permanent survival would be. There were no trees, no soil suitable for crops, and no reliable wildlife patterns that could be depended upon year-round. The sea surrounding Ellesmere Island was unpredictable. Pack ice shifted without warning, sometimes opening narrow channels, sometimes sealing them shut for years. Ships could become trapped or crushed with little notice. Once winter arrived, escape was no longer possible. Human presence here was temporary by necessity. Any group arriving carried everything it needed to live, knowing that resupply was uncertain and retreat unlikely. Silence dominated the landscape. Sound traveled far in the cold air, then vanished. Even small movements felt exposed. It was into this environment that the Lady Franklin Bay expedition arrived in 1881, believing preparation and discipline could overcome isolation. The land itself offered no reassurance. The Lady Franklin Bay expedition was part of the first International Polar Year, a coordinated scientific effort launched in the early 1880s. Its purpose was not conquest or discovery in the popular sense, but measurement. Nations agreed to establish observation stations in the polar regions to collect synchronized data on weather, magnetism, tides, and astronomy. The Arctic, largely unmeasured, was considered essential to this effort. The United States Army Signal Corps was tasked with organizing the American contribution. Leadership was given to First Lieutenant Adolphus Greely, a career officer with experience in communications and logistics. Greely was not a polar explorer by background, but he was known for discipline, administrative competence, and a strict adherence to orders. Those qualities were considered sufficient. The expedition consisted of 25 men. Most were soldiers. Others were specialists, a surgeon, a photographer, a meteorologist, and trained observers. Few had prior experience in extreme polar conditions. Their preparation emphasized routine, hierarchy, and written instructions rather than adaptability. They were issued supplies calculated to last 3 years, with the understanding that annual relief ships would replenish food and fuel. In August 1881, the expedition reached Lady Franklin Bay on the northeastern coast of Ellesmere Island. They constructed a prefabricated station, later named Fort Conger. The site was chosen for its relative shelter and access to the sea during summer months. Once established, the men began regular scientific observations, recording temperatures, wind patterns, and magnetic readings at fixed intervals. During the first year, conditions matched expectations. Hunting supplemented rations. Sledging parties explored inland and along the coast, extending known geography farther north than previously achieved by Americans. Discipline remained intact. Greely enforced regulations strictly, including limits on alcohol, ration control, and daily schedules. The plan relied on one assumption above all others, that relief ships would arrive. The written orders were explicit. If no ship came by the summer of 1883, Greely was to abandon Fort Conger and move south toward established supply caches. The margin for error was narrow, but on paper, the system appeared sound. The first relief ship was expected in the summer of 1882. It did not arrive. Sea ice along the coast remained dense and unbroken longer than anticipated, blocking access to Lady Franklin Bay. From Fort Conger, the expedition could do nothing but wait and continue its work. The men recorded their observations and adjusted rations slightly, assuming the delay was temporary. A second attempt was planned for the following year. By the summer of 1883, expectations were higher. Supplies were running lower, but they were still within calculated limits. Again, no ship appeared. Unknown to the men at Fort Conger, the relief vessels sent by the United States had failed to reach them, turned back by ice or misjudgment. Supply caches intended to support a southward retreat were either poorly placed or never landed. Greely now faced a decision governed by his written orders. Remaining at Fort Conger without resupply was no longer permitted. In August 1883, he ordered the station abandoned. The expedition loaded what supplies they could carry onto boats and sledges and began moving south along the coast of Ellesmere Island, following a route they believed would lead to cached food and eventual rescue. The journey was slow. Ice conditions were worse than expected. Boats were dragged over frozen surfaces, then relaunched into open water, only to be stopped again. Food consumption increased with the physical effort. When the expedition reached the locations where supplies were supposed to be stored, they found little or nothing. By late summer, the men reached Cape Sabine, farther south but still isolated. Winter was approaching. The ice was closing in. With no shelter prepared and no reliable food source secured, the expedition established a temporary camp, later known as Camp Clay. The movement south had ended. There was no remaining path forward and retreat was impossible. Camp Clay was established on a narrow strip of land near Cape Sabine, exposed to wind from the sea and backed by ice-covered terrain. The site offered little protection. There were no permanent structures, only tents, salvaged materials, and a low stone shelter built from loose rock. Compared to Fort Conger, the camp was improvised and fragile. By the time the men settled in, their food supply was already critically reduced. Official rations were recalculated and cut sharply. Each man received small daily portions of preserved meat, bread, and tea. There was no margin. Any loss, spoilage, or theft had immediate consequences. Hunting was attempted whenever weather allowed. Small parties searched for seals, birds, and occasional polar bears. Success was rare. Game in the area was scarce and ammunition was limited. When an animal was killed, it was carefully divided under supervision. Bones were boiled repeatedly. Scraps were saved. Nothing was discarded. Routine became essential. Greely maintained formal discipline, believing order was necessary for survival. Duties were assigned daily. Scientific observations continued as long as instruments functioned. Records were kept even as conditions worsened. The act of recording served both a practical and psychological purpose, preserving structure in an environment where time was beginning to blur. As winter set in, darkness returned. The sun disappeared for months. Temperatures dropped further and movement outside the shelter became dangerous. Fuel was scarce. Fires were kept small and brief. Clothing deteriorated. Frostbite became common, first affecting fingers and toes, then more severe cases as weakness increased. Physical decline was gradual but steady. Weight loss was visible. Strength diminished. Tasks that had once been routine became exhausting. Men slept longer but rested less. Illness spread easily in the confined space. The surgeon did what he could, but there were no medicines left that could reverse starvation. Mental strain increased alongside physical weakness. Hunger became constant, no longer a sensation but a condition. Conversations narrowed. Arguments became more frequent, often over small matters. Greely enforced regulations strictly, including a standing order that theft of food would be punished severely. The rule was known to all. Despite the conditions, attempts were made to signal for rescue. Flags were raised when possible. Fires were lit during brief daylight periods near the end of winter. No response came. The men could not know whether relief ships had failed again or had never been sent. As months passed, deaths began to occur. At first, they were attributed to illness or exposure. Later, starvation was undeniable. Bodies were buried in shallow graves or placed under stones where the ground could not be dug. The number of living men steadily declined. Camp Clay did not collapse suddenly. It narrowed. Life was reduced to waiting, rationing, and endurance. Authority remained, but it was increasingly strained. The system that had been designed to sustain the expedition now operated under conditions it had never been meant to face. By the spring of 1884, Camp Clay had entered its final phase. The number of men able to perform regular duties had fallen sharply. Several were confined to their bedding, too weak to stand. Others moved slowly, conserving energy with each step. Starvation had altered judgment as well as strength. Deaths became more frequent. Some men died quietly during sleep. Others declined over days, unable to eat the portions provided to them. Each death reduced the demand on the remaining food, but it also reduced labor and morale. The balance never improved. Greely continued to enforce discipline, though his authority was increasingly difficult to maintain. The written regulations remained in effect, including the standing order regarding theft of rations. Food was stored centrally and issued under supervision. Despite this, theft occurred. Small amounts at first, taken secretly, then discovered through discrepancies in inventory. In April 1884, one of the men was caught stealing food. The act was undeniable, and Greely convened a formal proceeding with the officers still capable of participating. The regulations prescribed a severe response. The man was executed by firing squad. Later, another theft led to a second execution. These events were recorded without commentary in the expedition's official records. The executions did not restore order. They underscored the severity of the situation and deepened the strain among the survivors. Trust eroded. Men watched one another closely. Silence replaced conversation. Medical conditions worsened. Scurvy weakened gums and joints. Infections went untreated. Some men experienced confusion and memory loss. Time was measured less by dates and more by deaths. The camp's population continued to decline. By early June, only 6 men remained alive. They were severely emaciated, unable to move without assistance. Food was nearly exhausted. Rescue, if it came, would arrive too late for most. The survivors made no plans. They waited. On June 22, 1884, a relief expedition finally reached Cape Sabine. The force was led by U.S. Navy Lieutenant Winfield Scott Schley, commanding a small fleet that had succeeded where earlier efforts had failed. When the rescuers approached Camp Clay, they found no signals, no movement, and no immediate indication of life. Inside the camp, they discovered the remains of the expedition. Bodies lay where men had fallen, some partially covered, others left exposed. Of the original 25 men, only 6 were still alive. They were unable to stand. Several could not speak clearly. All were severely underweight and suffering from advanced starvation. Adolphus Greely was among the survivors. He was barely conscious when found. The others included the expedition's surgeon and several enlisted men. Medical care began immediately, though options were limited. Food was administered cautiously to avoid shock. Some of the survivors required assistance even to swallow. The rescue party recorded the condition of the camp and the bodies. Graves were marked where possible. The dead were counted. 19 men had died. The cause was primarily starvation, with exposure and illness contributing. The executions were confirmed through written records recovered from the camp. The survivors were transported south as quickly as conditions allowed. 2 men died after rescue due to the effects of prolonged starvation. Ultimately, 6 men lived long enough to leave the Arctic. The expedition was over. The return of the surviving 6 men drew public attention, though the coverage was factual and restrained. Newspapers reported the deaths, the executions, and the severe conditions without embellishment. The story became a case study in Arctic exploration and the limits of planning in extreme environments. Adolphus Greely faced inquiries but was largely exonerated. Official reports emphasized that the failures of relief, not leadership, had led to most deaths. Lessons were recorded regarding supply chains, the necessity of timely resupply, and the hazards of isolation in polar regions. Future expeditions would benefit from these findings. The Lady Franklin Bay expedition became a reference point in polar history. It demonstrated both the capacity of humans to endure extreme conditions and the vulnerability that comes with dependence on fragile logistics. Its documentation, including daily observations and careful records, continued to inform scientific and military planning. For the men who survived, the Arctic remained a quiet presence. Their experience did not end in triumph, nor in dramatized heroism. Survival had been measured, procedural, and at times brutal. The expedition existed now as a record of what could be endured, a quiet account of endurance, calculation, and the limitations imposed by geography. The Arctic itself remained unchanged. Ice and wind shaped the land. Indifferent to human presence, the story of the expedition lingered only in documents and memory, a silent testament to life maintained in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The silence returned, as it always had, across Ellesmere Island.